The Y Curve with Phil Dobby and Roger Hearing.
Trains cancelled, operations delayed, cold and collapsing classrooms.
Why has the fabric of the UK reached breaking point?
Is it part of an inability or an unwillingness to fund the maintenance of our society?
Are we living beyond our means?
Are there new steps a new government could take to make sure that things work, that the system that we pay for actually functions for everyone?
Can Britain be mended?
The Y Curve.
So I think it was David Cameron, wasn't it, who coined the phrase broken Britain. I mean, some people would argue that in the end of the day, you then went on to really break it. But I mean, at the time, his point was it was all about crime, teenage pregnancies, all that sort of stuff.
But it's a different thing now. I mean, it's more to do with the basic things, the trains, transport system, education, hospitals, getting a GP, getting NHS dentists. I mean, all the systems that are there, supposedly still functioning and actually aren't.
No. And then, councils going bankrupt as well. In fact, wherever you look, it's just like it doesn't feel like
things are
working quite as well as it should. I mean, when you start to get schools falling apart, concrete crumbling, there's something badly wrong.
Well,
isn't
it's all to do with maintenance. You have systems, whether it's systems or buildings or whatever it is, you maintain them. You try and make sure they keep working, and that seems to me is what hasn't been going on. Now, whether that's to do with government short-termism, lack of money, I mean, I don't know.
Well, the government will say it's lack of money. Well, they'll say, well, we can't spend any more. And that is the question. How do you make things stack up? Because we went through a long period of austerity. We were told, well, if the government spends more, there'll be more debt. That'll create more inflation, supposedly. We got the inflation anyway, even with austerity. So, may as well spend the money. But, and all of that just raises the question, how do you balance it all out? If we're going to spend more and fix all of these things, where does the money come from?
And what do we spend on first? That's where the priorities. There are always going to be priorities in these things. But I suppose you say, well, OK, in the past, the government, maybe you might suggest that this current government perhaps tended to favour the private sector, the more wealthy. But even they, get problems when things start breaking down. They find the roads they drive on have potholes, the classrooms that they send their kids to, much I suppose they send them to private schools, but even so, the basics of life still seem to not quite function. Surely at some level they realise that and can direct funds there.
Well, you fly your private jet over the potholed roads.
I suppose you do, yes.
But I mean, it is. But you touch on it there. I mean, the real issue is the fact that the wealth divide is getting so much greater. So I wonder whether Britain is broken for the wealthy. I suspect not.
No, but there are certain basic things, power supplies. I mean, the absolute things you don't replicate even if you are wealthy. You don't build yourself an environment that has no interaction with the rest. So you have to use some of these things yourselves. So even the wealthy would begin to say, hang on a second, this stuff just isn't functioning as it should.
Yeah, well, I mean, Rishi did actually have to pay, I think he paid it himself to have that extra power put to the local exchange so that they could heat his swimming pool.
That's important, isn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, they are suffering. But 3 million people last year supposedly used a food bank. I mean, that's, we are a civilised society and we get numbers like that. So,
poverty is real and getting worse. As you said, the wealth gap is there. So the question then is, OK, supposedly there may or may not be in the next 12 months a change of government.
Yeah.
What would be top of the list? How do you square this? How do you deal with the incoming administration? The old administration, we all know it didn't work. So now you have to say, well, what would be the priorities of an incoming administration? How would you actually make it work without also screwing up the economy?
Yeah. And you talk about priorities. I mean, they're all priorities, aren't they? Just say, well, let's not worry about the health service too much. Let's focus on education. Well, let's not focus on the fact that people are starving. Yeah. You've got to do all of that, or the fact that trains don't run on time.
Or the base, or people travel over 100 miles to find an NHS dentist.
Yeah.
I mean,
you've
the
got
most
to do
basic
all
level
of those. Yeah. There's no prioritising. It's like everything has to be fixed. How do you do that when we have come down so far? But is it just Britain, or is it the whole of the world facing this problem?
I think it tends to be much more. I think there's a sense that systems in Britain are not being maintained. This maintenance principle, the idea that you not only have to have a system, you have to make sure it actually works. It's all very well having ambitions to do X, Y, and Z, which the government puts out there, but if it doesn't actually on the day, you ring up, you actually get someone, you make an appointment, something happens.
But is that because there's something in the British nature which is just a little bit overly bureaucratic? I do know when I moved back here from Australia, I thought there's just a lot that's not right about this country that I wasn't aware of within Australia, that things seem to
function better
normally. Yeah. And is that because we just make stuff too complicated?
I'm not sure that's... I think it's to do with using the money that we have. I mean, there is an argument that we are living beyond our means, that we have too much of this stuff, which we thought we could afford, and now we can't afford, and we have to cut our coat according to our cloth, and we're still trying to keep everything going.
Of things?
Well, some of the most basic things. But if we have a certain number of hospitals, but we don't actually have enough medical staff to run them properly...
No, but we've certainly got enough sick people, though.
Well, exactly.
Which is the determining factor.
Yeah, absolutely.
So all of these things have to be done. So an impossible question we're asking this week.
Well, it's a question we're going to ask George Monbiot, who the Guardian columnist and writer of environmental subjects, but on many other subjects as well. And he's going to give us his take on this, and he joins us now.
So, George, I mean, it sounds like, just, as we've been saying in our introduction there, there's just so much that has to be done. Is Britain so badly broken, repairing it in any way that is sort of going to be acceptable to the vast majority of the population is just going to take years?
It will take years. There's no doubt about that. It's not impossible, but there's this huge backlog. It's a cumulative underfunding of public services, and that really goes back over 40 years. We've had 40 years with a few breaks of austerity, of privatization, of the dumping of costs onto the public, the transferring of profits into the private domain. And the result of that is that many of our public services are in a really shocking state.
But the dumping of costs, the interesting phrase. So that's sort of like the user pays type approach. Is that what you're talking about there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a transfer of costs from either the public sector or its privatized outlets to individuals. Even when we're not sort of handing over money to them, often it costs us a lot more. So, for instance, there's been a near collapse of special educational needs provision in many parts of the country, and some parents, as a result, have had to give up their jobs in order to look after their children who are not being provided for. And so that's a massive cost to the household.
Yes, it's a self-defeating thing, in effect.
Yes, I mean, it's not saving any money, it's just transferring who gets the money and who has to pay that money.
Now, I'm interested you talked about 40 years, because what you're then saying is that this began in the Thatcher era.
It's not just the austerity that we've seen over the last decade.
Has it really been going on that long? Because, obviously, Thatcher era of privatisation, but, many people remember the winter of discontent in the 70s when, again, things didn't seem to work that well. Is it really possible to draw a line and say, no, it was when Thatcher came in that it started?
It's not a clear line, because some of the underinvestment goes back even further, and particularly with water and sewerage. I mean, that's a real shocking failure, which seems to survive all changes of government. The last time there was really serious sustained investment was in the Victorian era. And we are just way behind. We have pumping stations which are suitable for half the size of the population we have today. We have water treatment works which are just antiquated. They're falling apart. Everything is falling apart. The rate at which they've been replacing leaking pipelines means that it would take 2,000 years to get the network up to scratch. And this is it is a long-standing failure, but that failure was accelerated by neoliberalism, which is what Thatcher in particular represented.
But you give an example there, though, with the plumbing is pretty old in this country, whether it's in the house or underground. So that is part of the problem, isn't it? The country's just so old. There's just so much legacy stuff, which is expensive to replace.
Yeah, it's not an excuse to say we're an old country, because there's plenty of countries old and new which do invest or have invested and make a much better job of some of these public services than we do. But these are political decisions. And very often the political arithmetic is, well, we're not going to reap the benefits if we invest now, because it's going to take 10 years for that investment to be felt, and whoever's in power then will be the beneficiary of it. And so political short-termism is kind of baked in, but there's also the ideology, and there's ideologies which say the state shouldn't be competent. The state shouldn't be spending money. The state shouldn't be providing public services except the absolute bare minimum. And the more we manage to carve off and the less we provide, the greater display of our macho prowess that represents.
Isn't the ideology actually not that the state shouldn't be competent, but that the private sector is more competent in doing these things, and that if we can buy in experience and fiscal discipline, that's actually a better way to do it.
And he asked that question with a straight face, by the way.
Yeah. Well, this is the triumph of hope over experience, isn't it?
You think?
But I mean, the argument is, isn't it, that, you know, we privatise water. Those privatised companies should be the ones who are doing all this maintenance. They just haven't been doing it. So that must mean the regulator hasn't been tough enough on them.
Well, it hasn't, but there's also an inbuilt structural problem here that when you privatise a public service like water, you are asking the private companies to do two completely different and contradictory things. One of them is to supply the public service and at the best value possible. The other is to pursue their fiduciary duties to their shareholders, which is to maximise revenue. And the two things are simply not compatible with each other. You can't optimize both variables. And so, yes, it's true that there were big problems with our water and sewerage system even before privatization. But those problems have become much worse because of those split incentives. And we've seen 72 billion. In fact, I'm probably out of date by now, but a year ago, it was 72 billion pounds had been directed to shareholders as dividends. All that money and much more should have been invested in the network to upgrade sewerage and upgrade the water piping system and all the other things that are failing.
All right, so we're talking about the water system here, and that is, you know, by a sort of general consensus, one of the worst areas of broken Britain. But if you take something like schools, for example, you've seen terrible pictures of classrooms where kids are wearing huge coats because it's too cold, where we know that the concrete that's there is faulty and all these kind of things. Now, that isn't privatised in any meaningful sense. It's maybe localised with councils. So again, what is the issue there? Because that is a place where, in the current system, public money should be being invested.
Yes, so the issue here is austerity. You know, it's these two great fists crunching the public sector. One of them is privatisation and the other is austerity. And in this case, absolutely austerity is what we're looking at. Labour had something called Building Schools for the Future. It was beset with problems. It wasn't perfect, not least because they tried to do as much as possible right across the public sector through something called the Private Finance Initiative, which has turned out to be an absolute catastrophe, as some of us predicted at the time. But they were actually doing what they said, and they were building schools for the future, putting up new buildings, repairing old buildings, and they were spending around £8 billion a year. In 2010, the Conservatives scrapped that, and there's been a massive and rising repair backlog ever since. That was calculated in 2021 as £11 billion, but this was before we ran into this issue of aerated concrete, this sort of aero-like stuff, which has got an expected lifespan of 30 years, but in many cases has just been left. And now the ceilings are collapsing, and it's been only a matter of luck that they haven't collapsed on classrooms full of children yet.
Yeah, it was amazing, isn't it? That first of all, 30 years would be seen as being acceptable. You know, if you were running a business and something was going to last 30 years, you'd have it on a spreadsheet somewhere saying, right, we've got to replace that in 25 years, but it seems to get forgotten about. And
you're saying that's a business would do that. That kind of goes back to the idea that perhaps private sector would be doing it.
Well, maybe because they don't know what they've got as well. That's part of the problem, isn't it? When you inherit a public asset, do the companies actually know the state of what they've inherited and what they're supposed to be looking after? But I mean, the broader question is, through all of this, I mean, it gets down to regulations generally, almost wherever you look. If you look at, for example, the situation with fire hazards, and using material which is hazardous.
After the Grenfell disaster.
After Grenfell as one example, it's just who's got their eye on the ball through all of this? It's as though, we're not looking close enough at almost any aspect of life.
And of course, the really biggest failure of all is the environmental failure, where we are stacking up enormous problems for the future, and politicians are actively turning away from it, pretending not to be aware of it, trying not to see what the issue is. And so I mean, but again, it's not an inevitability. It doesn't have to be like this. These are political choices. So, for instance, with Grenfell, there were loads of political choices made before that disaster happened. And there were loads of inflection points at which local government or central government could have said, these red lights are flashing. We should respond to that. We should respond to these warnings. They failed to do so again and again. And they were warned individually. People within Grenfell Tower constantly tried to raise the alarm about the fire hazard, and they were warned at the national level as well. But they just did not heed those warnings. They didn't respond
because
to
the
them.
question was who pays for it, wasn't it? That was the problem. I mean, if it was very clear that there was the money available, then it would happen. But the government was trying to say it's local authorities. Local authorities were trying to say, well, it's the residents or the developers. Everyone was saying, don't care who it is, so long as it's not us.
Because the reason they're saying it is because the funds are there. And George, that's the problem, isn't it? That we are as a society used to a certain level of service, public service, and is it possible we actually can't afford that? Our punching power as a world power isn't such now that we have the funds to be able to do all these things properly, and we have to, the awful phrase, cut our coat according to our cloth.
Well, it's quite striking what we find we can afford. So, for instance, in the bank bailout, the government issued £124 billion in loans and share purchases. In the pandemic, it spent 300 or 400 billion pounds, depending on which estimate you believe. Huge amounts of that money in the pandemic were incidentally squandered. All those corrupt contracts, a VIP lane for PPE, test and trace, a total catastrophe, Nightingale hospitals. Yeah, they're throwing money around like water. But as soon as there's something you really need, as soon as there's something particularly which the poorest in society need, like the people in the Grenfell Tower, then, oh, sorry, we can't hear you. There's no money. There's no such thing as a magic money tree. Oh, boy, there is a magic money tree. When they want to shake it, loads of fruit falls down. And I'm not someone who's committed to the idea of modern monetary theory. I don't know if you've followed this.
We're very aware.
Yes, I'm sure you are. Yes, but the response to the pandemic is possibly a partial vindication of it. That what it shows is that the government doesn't have to raise all the money that it spends. That it can basically magic spending into existence. That's what governments do. And that doesn't all have to be inflationary. Of course, it can be inflationary. It depends on the circumstances.
Obviously, it has been as well this time. But that was nothing to do with MMT per se. That was the fact that the money that was created was to help us out, and it went into people's bank accounts, and there was too much cash sitting in people's bank accounts, and we were putting too much demand on stuff that just didn't
the money
exist.
went in the wrong place, basically.
Yes, that's right.
But you're right. It has partially vindicated, hasn't it? In that, the government can spend more than it's getting in tax, so long as it's sort of in line with GDP growth, and it can be expanding a little bit beyond that. It's just a question of getting it out of kilter, isn't it? That's the concern.
And again, all these are choices. I keep coming back to this, and sorry to be repetitive, but a situation like Grenfell Tower, you had these people who are customarily disregarded by governments. Many of them were immigrants, or recently, or they or their parents had come from abroad. Many of them were very poor, and they're just passed over. We saw something similar with the post office scandal, with all those false convictions. People like that don't get listened to. But Nigel Farage, his bank account at Coutts gets stopped. Instant action. Boof. Yeah. The government's all over it like a rash. We've got to do something about this appalling scandal.
This is all politics, George, and the situation, the system we have, the democratic system we have, means that politicians think in 5-year terms most of the time. They need to get re-elected. It's only natural that they will tend to favour those who they think make it more likely that they will remain in power to do the things they want to do. And that's not going to change in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. So how on earth do we tackle this?
Well, this is the thing that we need to resist. When we see politicians responding to special interests, when we see them effectively truncating democracy because they're not listening to the people as a whole, but they're listening to lobby groups or listening to particular powerful people, then that's what we should be mobilizing against. And in fact, that is the stuff of politics. And I'm afraid it's quite disappointing to see how Labour is missing open goal after open goal at the moment, where it could be standing up against what is effectively corruption, is a response to particular commercial interests rather than to the people of this nation. And it's what should be right at the heart of political choice. I mean, the greatest failures in politics come about as a result of the spending of money into politics. They come about as a result of campaign financing and all the other finance which is thrown around in the political sphere, ensuring that democracy gets supplanted by plutocracy. And that's what we should be resisting day in, day out.
But how do we do that? How do we take that on? Because it is something in the end that can only be done through politics, and there's no incentive for them to change it, is there?
Well, I mean, there might be incentives for other parties to change it. There's not much incentive for the Tories to change that, of course. And the trouble is that Labour is trying to play the same game. They're trying to raise as much money as possible. But, there's a golden opportunity here to say we're going to clean up politics by putting a much smaller maximum level. In fact, we don't have a maximum level on individual donations, do we? We have a maximum level on the amount that a party can take, but not on how much any one person can contribute to that amount. So you end up with this sort of oligarchic funding where a small number of people can supply the bulk of a party's funds, and then they achieve as a result massive disproportionate influence over politics. And there's a golden opportunity for Labour to say, this is corrupt, let's end it.
And it seems like it's not an insurmountable problem. There's two things going on. One is that we've got this growing inequality within the country. So the Gini coefficient has gone, it's at 35.7, or it was last year. In the late 70s, it was 25. So this is the idea of the Gini coefficient is if you take two random people, the chance of their income being exactly the same. So the larger it is, then the greater the range of income. So it's gone from 25 to 36 in the last 50 years. Yeah. So we've got a lot of people getting very wealthy, and then the people who are struggling, the 3 million people who were on food banks last year. So that is the one issue, and that's been going since actually before Thatcher. It
goes back a long way.
Time BT before Thatcher. So so that's one issue. And then the other issue is, well, okay, if you tax people more at the top end, so you start to reduce that inequality, then you do have more money available for some of these public services. It seems obvious, and then the problem with that is the wealthy people will say, but we don't want to be taxed. And yet at Davos last week, they were all there saying tax us more.
Somewhere.
Somewhere. Yeah.
But that's the problem. If you like, the experiments that have been made, even the Truss experience, suggests that the financial markets are very able to change the world in a brief moment.
Yeah.
And if they don't like what they hear, they can do that. And that has real world economic effects on our ability to do all the things that we want to do.
It does.
No, I don't think it is. I think it has a real world effect on those people who hold those assets. I don't think it has too much influence on them. What's your point on, George? I think you're talking about the markets, which is very different to what we're talking about, which is how governments and society fund the...
Yeah, but they can only fund it if they have the money to do it, which is when the markets at least are willing to lend money to the government.
We rely too much on the...
George, do you think this is nonsense, or do you think I'm onto something?
George was talking about modern monetary theory. It's very little to do with the markets.
So he didn't completely back it. George,
I think there's loads of opportunities to raise taxes in ways which are just not going to touch 99% of people. So, for instance, raising the top rate of capital gains tax to meet the top rate of income tax. There's quite a few billions in that. A Robin Hood tax on financial transactions. You could do pretty well out of that. Land value taxation, taxing the most valuable property.
Yeah.
There's
just a tax on wealth generally. Actually,
I mean, there's lots of opportunities here. And what will happen is that the rich people will say, oh, I'll leave the country. Whereupon the great majority of people will say, good riddance to you. Here's a one-way ticket. Sod off. If you're not going to...
But then those people, if their people aren't there, they're not going to be paying tax.
Well, I mean,
they do leave.
I mean, the fact is they don't. They always threaten to. But unless we've got a full-on Venezuela situation, they don't. They've got homes here. They've got kids at school. They'll rumble and grumble about it, but then they very seldom act on it. And those who do are generally the most antisocial and unpleasant of the lot, and no one would miss them.
Yeah, and they'll bring house prices down, if they all go. Well, I mean, because that is the other element of all of this, isn't it? As to where money goes. I mean, the average house price to earnings ratio is now over 7 compared to 3 in 1996. In London, it's up over 11. So, I mean, that's another issue. First of all, how do our kids afford to buy houses? But also, those of us who are paying a mortgage, we've got so little money left over. Of course, we don't want to pay more tax because we've paid it to the bank for our mortgage. And funnily enough, banks seem to be doing quite well out of all of this.
But don't worry, the government's got a solution. And the Criminal Justice Bill, which is passing through Parliament now, if you are found rough sleeping, you can be fined £2,500, which of course you'd have in your back pocket, or imprisoned. So they will provide accommodation for homeless people, but only in a prison cell.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you don't need the 10 then, do you?
They move the tents off. But I mean, the point of all this was, so the conclusion we're sort of saying is we need more money, and that money needs to be spent in a long-term way. That's the fundamental. Yeah. And how do we incentivize that? Because even the governments we're talking about, perhaps potentially a Labour government later this year or early next, with the money that we're talking about, the tax potential, they are still going to want to stay in power. And okay, they may not have to kowtow necessarily to the interest groups we were talking about, but they're going to want to stay in power. So they will be still working on that 5-year cycle and winning the arguments on that alone.
I think a lot of it's about narrative. The Labour is absolutely transfixed by this Tory tax and spend narrative. We can't be seen to be taxing and spending. And you think, why can't you be seen to be taxing and spending? What militates against that? Why can't you make the case that we need to mend this country, and mend this country would be a pretty good slogan, I think, for the Labour Party right now, and that's going to require long-term spending, and that what a responsible government that cares about its people does is long-term spending, and that getting past that short-term cycle becomes your selling point. It becomes the thing which people would vote for if you only made it your selling point. But instead we have we're going to stick to Tory spending plans because otherwise we'd be seen as irresponsible. No, it's exactly the opposite. They're just buying into the narrative of their opponents, and it's very disappointing to see.
Is it all just money though, and long-term investment? I just wonder whether in this country, I spent a quarter of a century outside the country. I came back and I thought, my first impression was, Brits, we have a great way of making things more complicated than they seem to need to be. And I just wonder whether, we need to almost go through regulations and simplify things and say what can and can't be done. I'll give you an example. So we know councils are going bankrupt. And we know a chunk of them are going bankrupt because there's, I think, how many now have voluntarily issued a Section 114 notice? Got Slough, Croydon, Thurrock.
Woking, I think.
So the interesting thing about Woking, that was going to be my point. Some of these are going bankrupt because they just don't have enough money to provide the services. Woking is going bankrupt because it used taxpayers' money or ratepayers' money to invest in infrastructure, because they had this grand plan that Woking was going to be this fantastic new city that was, going to be a growth hub for the region. And it all went badly wrong. Money that was just spent just was wasted. And now they're paying for that. So simply saying to councils, hang on a sec, just back in your box. Just provide the services and we'll make sure you've got enough money. And that's just one example. I'm sure you go through all sorts of other walks of life and other industries like train companies. You could probably simplify, what their operating requirement is without necessarily renationalising them. Some of these things will need to be renationalised as well, I'm sure. But we've got to get simplify things so it's very clear what the objectives are.
And where responsibility lies.
And where responsibility is. And then, and then you can put money behind it at that point. And you might find you need a lot less.
I mean, I'm a bit wary about this call for simplifying regulations because, of course, it's what certain very predatory businesses have been calling for a long time, and simplification very often means deregulating them. I think we need to be very clear about what exactly we're calling for in circumstances like this. There have been some very foolish council spending decisions, and there's no inoculation against stupidity. There's lots of silly things are done, regardless of the environment in which they take place. But I don't think anyone would be against. Anyone on my side of the political divide would be against the idea that councils should be investing more in public services and should be trying to improve their towns and cities. If not in a sort of very self-aggrandizing and foolish way, as we've been talking about. But, and of course, councils are absolutely strapped for cash, not least because of this highly regressive and extremely limited council tax banding system, which hasn't been updated since 1991, where the richest people pay only a little bit more than the very poorest people. And
a little bit better than the poll tax, but not much.
Not much, indeed. It's not quite a flat tax, but it's a very gently sloping one.
So David Cameron, because he really termed the phrase "broken Britain," didn't he? When he was pitching for
Isn't
power.
He back in government now?
Yes, he's back. But, he's back in a lot quieter, though, isn't he? But he talked about, a very different broken Britain. He talked about selfishness, behaving as if your choices had no consequences, children without fathers, kind of perish the thought, schools without discipline, reward without effort, crime without punishment, rights without responsibilities. That was his broken Britain. Yes. So I feel like the dialogue has moved on a little bit from that. And the sort of broken Britain that we're talking about, I think you're right. Maybe it's a vote winner if the Labour Party were just to embrace
Mend
it.
Britain.
But fixing Britain.
Well, do you think they will embrace it, George? Do you think that the Keir Starmer government, whatever it says perhaps at this point in order to get to power, do you think they actually get what you're saying?
The problem is if they don't say it before they're in power, then they won't have a mandate to do it once they're in power. Yeah, and the media can very easily turn on them and say, well, no one voted for this because you didn't put it to the people. And in fact, it would be something of a deception of the people to campaign on one manifesto when having a completely different one in mind. So I don't think that Starmer will show any more courage in office than he's so far shown out of office, and that amounts to very little.
It's rather depressing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is rather depressing.
And so what happens then? We just get more privatisation. It feels like that's going to be the answer. Well, if these things are broken, if we can't manage to fund our schools, we'll just have to privatise more of it. If the National Health Service can't function as it currently is, we'll just have to privatise more of it. It's just it seems to be the answer over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, and that was more or less what Blair and Brown did with their whole private finance initiative was instead of just stumping up the money in the usual way from government coffers, they tried to bridge the gap by bringing in private companies effectively to manage and run public services. And what the effect of that was to make the balance of spending look better at the time, but to load the future with massive liabilities, which have been absolutely crippling to hospitals and many other parts of the public sector, as they're having to pay off these huge debts to the private sector. And I think that's, Starmer's not going to do another private finance initiative, but he's going to try to find ways of solving these crises without actually spending more money. And frankly, there isn't a way. You've just got to spend more money.
So not being a conspiracy theory, we're not conspiracy theorists on this podcast. No. Well, and unless we find that actually it's very good for ratings, in which case we might do a bit of a pivot on that. But I mean, we're not conspiracy theorists as it currently stands. And yet a conspiracy theorist would say, isn't it interesting, isn't it? If you let all of these systems collapse, then it makes it easier to privatise. And, so is that really actually part of the agenda?
That assumes a long-term
Is it not neglect? It is, long
which they don't have.
It's not neglect, it's actually a long-term strategy.
Yeah, well, you can see what it's doing in dentistry. This is exactly what the approach has been in dentistry. It's to put these impossible conditions on NHS dentists, including these units of dental care, which where you never quite meet the costs of what the dentist is spending. You effectively load the dentist with all sorts of conditions, which just make, you have to be a very altruistic person now to supply NHS dental care, because you lose money, and the only people still supplying it are subsidizing it out of their private practice. But there's been no government announcement saying we're shutting down all NHS dental care. They're doing it stealthily, but the effect is just the same.
It's the same. And Keir Starmer's answer: state-sponsored toothbrushing. That's as far as it goes.
I mean, as we draw this to a conclusion, George, I suppose that the point you're making is that if Keir Starmer tomorrow said, your slogan, "Mend Britain," that there would be a public support for that he would not be imperiling his chances of getting into power. It is a vote winner. If that were really the case, wouldn't he do it? I mean, the left's case has always been, well, if we put the Jeremy Corbyn case, if we put all this out there, in the end, people will support it.
But you've said yourself on this podcast many times before, not that you're being repetitive, of course,
I am sometimes.
That he's just too scared. He doesn't want to lose the election.
Does he have reason to be scared?
Let's look at what he's scared of. I think he's more scared of the billionaire media than he is of the people. And that is a huge part of the problem here, that we've got this incredibly dominant, powerful group of offshore billionaires who are telling us what to think and telling us how to act. And somehow they've been allowed to become a more important political force than the electorate has.
Yeah, and a BBC that's scared to move.
Yeah, too right.
But the next generation doesn't read newspapers, so maybe there could be relief in that. Except I suppose they get influenced in other ways.
Well,
by billionaires overseas.
And it's not as if billionaires don't own social media.
Yeah,
also true. Yeah. George, thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you.
I can't say it's been an optimistic session, but it's been really interesting, and we shall see.
It's good to talk. Right. Hopefully get you on again soon, George. Thanks.
Sure. No,
Thanks,
lovely
George.
to talk. Thanks so much, guys. Cheers then.
Take care.
Bye.
All very interesting stuff. So next week, what are we going to talk about?
Well, we're going to talk about miscarriages of justice.
No,
because
something else that's not working.
It clearly isn't. I mean, the system to try and look at cases that could represent injustice, and we know with what happened with the post office workers, of course, that injustices can persist for a long time. And the system doesn't, even when they know that these are miscarriages of justice, they seem to take an incredibly long time to go through.
To such a point that so many people have died and haven't seen justice.
Yeah, and well beyond the post office, there are lots of individual cases, and we've had several in the past few years, where people clearly have been put in prison for many years and come out, and the system hasn't worked. When eventually their cases have been brought back to court, they have been exonerated.
No.
But
is this occasional, or is this a systemic problem?
I think it's systemic. I think there's a lot of this going on, and the problem is, yes, obviously most people in prison probably say that they're innocent. That is true, but there are some horrendous cases of people who clearly are not guilty of what they've been put in prison for, and they lose 15, 20 years of their lives. I mean, even up until recently, there was a horrible thing where the Home Office would charge people for board and lodging for the amount of time they'd actually been in prison, even if they shouldn't have been there.
Incredible, isn't it?
Well, it shows the attitude that's out there. And the system, which is the Criminal Cases Review Commission, it absolutely creaks. And we're going to talk to someone who knows this really well, Glyn Maddox, who is a very prominent solicitor campaigning on a lot of these cases, and get a sense of why it doesn't work and how we are guilty, really, of injustice to a fairly large number of people who shouldn't be in prison but are, just because we haven't got the resources or time or expertise to put into actually sorting their cases out.
Right, and you have spent a bit of time inside, haven't you? Not actually inside.
You weren't ever going to mention that.
Visiting people rather than actually...
That is true. That is
true. So I'd be interested in finding out more about that as well next week.
We'll talk about it.
Yeah, okay, that's next week on The Y Curve. Join us for that. Have a great week.
Bye.
The Y Curve.